じゃあ、始めますね。聞こえてますね。大丈夫ですか？皆さん、顔見せてください。お願いします。えっと、こちらで、ファイル共有、画面共有。待ってくださいね。もうすぐ始めます。ちょっと待ってください。はい、見えましたか？はい。先週言いましたようにね、今日と来週とで、国際関係理論を取り上げます。今までもね、理論には少しずつ触れてきてるんですよね。国際政治史では、その大国間のパワー・オブ・バランス論というのを話しましたよね。So when we discussed the history of international politics, we discussed one theory which was related to that, and that was the balance of power, theory of balance of power. There was also reference to theory of interdependence in terms of economic relationships. We also refer to other theories in relation to specific areas that we studied, like the theory of nuclear deterrence. That was one theory. When we took up international law, we asked you to look at monism and dualism and all sorts of other theories. でも、これらは特定の領域とかテーマに限定された理論でしたよね。で、今日と来週以降はね、国際関係全体についての理論をもっと正面に据えて、体系的に見ていきたいと思います。So from now on, we'd like to look at theory in a more systematic way, looking at the international community or society as a whole. So going back to basics, そもそも論に戻りまして、理論とは何かということをちょっと考えてみたいと思います。What is theory? In fact, we all use theory in our minds every day, more or less unconsciously and intuitively. みんな日常的に直感的にというか、あんまり意識しないで理論って使ってます。で例えば具体例ですけどね、you just think about a very daily experience. Your mother, let's say, is in a good mood today. She's cheerful, which is unusual. So you naturally think why. どうして今日はお母さん機嫌がいいんだろうと。ね、普段いつもガミガミ言ってる人なんで、今日多分なんかいいことがあったんだろうと。こう直感的に考えますよね。で、なぜかっていうのは、それはいくつか理由があり得て、なんかお母さん競馬が好きだから馬券が当たったのかもしれないし、あるいはお父さんはね、普段喧嘩ばっかりしてんだけども、今日はなんかがあったのかなと、仲直りしたんだろうとかね。だから、そういうふうにいろいろ直感的に考えるっていう、実は因果関係を考えてるんですよね。わかりますよね、因果関係。So we're looking at, even in these mundane issues, daily issues, you sort of unconsciously do a mental exercise in causality. And you may recall what we looked at, the author of What is History, earlier on in this class. We looked at the book written by E.H. Carr. And in that, you may remember the case of the small traffic accident, the imagined traffic accident, which he quoted as an example. There are many causes to even a small traffic accident daily happening. But what's important is to distinguish between what's in the causes of which are important and which are not relatively not important. Causes which are generalizable。一般化できる原因が何かということが大事だということをカーが言ってましたよね。で、これってその国際関係の授業ですからね、この分野ではよく理論と実践ということを言います。これごめんなさい。スライドを送るのを忘れてましたけど、因果関係の話。それで理論と実践。We often talk about theory and practice, not just in this field, but I suppose in many fields, there is always discussion of that. And theory makes sense only, well, I mean, it may be interesting to look at theory for the pure sake of theory, but it makes practical sense when it's useful for social relationships, because we're after all looking at social relations here. Now let's just think about let's try and remember your very young days. What was the first practice that you had to be involved in when you were first a newborn baby? I suppose nobody can remember exactly, but a newborn child is thrown out in the world to learn, everything from scratch without any guidelines or theory to help it. And I suppose the baby has to first find out how to move around, how to coordinate different parts of its body, how to try and fall without hurting yourself too much, and all that sort of thing. It's basically lost in an unknown world. So it has to just go through a trial and error, stumbling around. 要するに右も左に分かんないけど、徐々に学んでいくわけですよね。そのうちね、人間って非常に他の動物とは多分違う。大事なことを、実践を通して学びますよね。それって何ですかね。2歳、3歳ぐらいになってくると、なんかとても大事な実践が出てきますよね。誰か想像つく人います？リンさん、何だろうと思います？我々が生まれて数年のうちに突き当たる一番大事な実践の学びって聞こえてますか？リンさん来ていらっしゃいますか？来てないかな？あ、いますね。はい。
聞こえてます。
はい。ちょっとよく聞こえないですけど、なんだろう。我々小さい時にまずね、見よう見まねで言葉を覚えますよね。So the small child starts to learn language, of course. And it's through a lot of trial and error, just try and repeat what the mother says and all that. But by the time you go to school, you come up to school, then you start learning your own native language a little more systematically. And then I suppose you get to learn grammar, don't you? ね、小学校で、何年生でしたかね、文法をようやく学びますよね、国語。だから、これ非常に典型的な身近な理論と実践の実例だと思うんですね。要するに実践だけいくら上達しても、その理論的な裏打ちがないと、あまり言葉もね、その整理された形でなかなか喋れない。だから理論と実践が両方つながって、so theory and practice links up and brings it up to a higher level. And I suppose this also applies to social relationships as well. When it comes to social relations or the structure of society, it's not maybe it's much more complex than, the process of a human being learning language even. もうちょっと具体例いきましょうね。So let's come to a specific example. Think of this proposition that North Korea is a threat to Japan. この命題ってね、日本にとってだけじゃないですけど、おそらくもう韓国も他の国も含めてなんですけども、北朝鮮は脅威だってみんな普段から当たり前にそう思ってますよね。So we all take this for granted, but just think for a while what it really means. Why do you think North Korea is a threat to Japan as well as to the other countries? Jocelyn, what's your take on this? Just let us know what you think out, just off the top of your head.
About the Korean threat?
Yeah. Why do you think this is so?
Well, Korea is closer to Japan than a lot of other countries. And they have, I think, I don't remember exactly, it was like 2018 or 2019, I think, that they had been testing explosives of some sort in the
they've been
Pacific.
repeating tests, nuclear tests, and shooting missiles and all that. So basically they have developed nuclear weapons. So that's the obvious answer that I suppose most people will give, because they have nuclear weapons. So they are a threat to us and the other countries around it. But I think we need to dig a little bit more into this in terms of learning theory, of course. Why have they developed nuclear weapons? What's behind that? What's in the background? So there must be other elements, you see. There may be quite a few, a number of direct causes, and there must be root causes, in the background. 核兵器をただ持ってるってことだけで簡単には説明でっていうのは他にも核兵器持ってる国があるわけですよね。中国ね、もっと大国で核兵器いっぱい持ってますよね。もっとたくさん持ってる。あるいは他の国、日本、アメリカももっとたくさん持ってますよね。だからそこは何が違うんだろうと、ロシアも持ってますけどね。So, despite just arguing that it's a threat because it has nuclear weapons, then we have to ask ourselves, why is North Korea different from the other countries who also have nuclear weapons, like China, the United States, and Russia, for example? What's the difference there? Bruno, what would be your answer to that question? Why is North Korea a threat, and why are the other nuclear countries who have nuclear weapons not a threat, or not that much a threat? What distinguishes North Korea?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, sure.
Well, I think like the main difference is that North Korea has like a political situation like much different from the other countries. Like we are talking about a dictatorship. So basically, I mean, it's very hard to have like diplomatic relations with North Korea. So basically, it can be like a wild card. So
a wild card, yeah.
Yeah, they can be like more threatening than the other countries. And because also with the other countries is like there is the chance to actually have a diplomatic relationship.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's a good answer, because it's a wild card in a nutshell. 一言で言うとね、なんかワイルドカードって日本語で何て言うんですかね。もうちょっと 若干難しい、とんでもないというかね、他と違うと非常に、どう違うかと、独裁的な政権だと。その通りですよね。だけどそもそもどうしてそうなったかな why have they become a wild card? We have to keep asking ourselves, and I think, in what way are they a wild card? North Korea is not the only dictatorship. There are other dictatorships, like the present Russia under President Putin he's pretty much a dictator, isn't he? So is Xi Jinping of China, more or less. I mean, there may be different opinions on this, but what kind of a dictatorship is North Korea? So you keep asking these questions and try and get to the root of it. And I think, one thing which is obvious is if you look at the regime, the global regime around nuclear weapons, the fundamental overriding regime is the NPT. 核兵器に関する国際法の国際システムのね、一番大事な枠組みっていうのは、核兵器不拡散体制ですね。不拡散条約ってなんですね。NPT っていう。で、これはさっきアメリカと中国だってイギリス、フランスもロシアも核兵器持ってるじゃないかと、北朝鮮どう違うんだって言ったら、何が一番違うって、他の5カ国はみんな合法的に持ってるんですよね。核不拡散体制っていうのはある意味で不公平な体制で、その5カ国は OK なんですよ。で、北朝鮮は実は NPT に入ってたんですけどね、最初は。だけど、加盟してた国で、それに違反して核兵器開発しちゃったっていうのはもう北朝鮮だけですね。So North Korea is the only country which was a member of the NPT treaty, but went against it by developing its own weapons, nuclear weapons, and it more or less has left the framework now. But it remains that it's not accepted by the other countries of the world. And it's through that history, it's not just through the NPT, but it's through the other many things that happened throughout history. I think we really need to go back to the last century or even the 19th century. And the two key world wars had a very pivotal role in making North Korea what it is now. For a start, it was after the Second World War ended. A few years after that, there was a tragic history of the Korean Peninsula being split into two by the Soviet Union and the United States at the time. So 朝鮮が分断されたという歴史があるわけですよね。でそこにもちろん遡ります。で、その前後には、戦争のこともあったし、それからソ連という共産主義国家とアメリカとの対立がありましたしね。それから朝鮮戦争があったわけですね。でその挙句に結局分断はより深まって、今に至っていると。でその後のもう長い歴史があるわけです。でそういった不幸な歴史ですよね、一言で言うと。それを通して、今の北朝鮮、国全体をひとまとめにして断言するっていうのは僕は嫌なんですけど、今の金王朝ですね、親子3代続いてる、金正恩っていう人が指導者になってて、この体制ですね、it's the Kim dynasty, if you wish to call it, because of the background and the history that it's come through the last, century or two, they have come to adapt a very specific pattern of behavior. 行動様式が非常に得意なんですね。非常に特殊なんですよ。で一言で言うと、もう他の国と正常な国際関係を結べない国なんですね。つまり、一旦約束守るんだけど、必ず大事なことは後で破るっていう、基本的に信頼関係を築けない国になってしまってます。だからそれがね、非常に歴史的な背景がいっぱいあって、でこういう説明すれば、なんだ当たり前だという気がすると思うんですけどね、この歴史を理解することで初めてどうしてこんな 行動様式を取る国になっちゃったかということが理解できます。まあ、よく瀬戸際戦略ということを言いますよね。自分の目的を達するためには、ものすごい脅しを使います。それで、まあ、基本的に立場、核兵器持ってるってこと以外ではものすごく弱い国ですからね。アメリカとか他の主要国に対抗して何か自分の、まあ、安全保障って言ってますけども、要求を落とすためには、もうすごい脅しを使って、ギリギリのところでちょっと情報を取ったら引くという瀬戸際戦略をもう典型的に使う国なんですね。Okay, so I don't want to dwell further on North Korea right now, but just to show you an example of why we need to look into causes, not just single or two causes, but to look into all sorts of backgrounds, including history. Now, just coming back to the discussion of theory in general, I'd like to just point out that there are good theories and there are bad theories. And what makes a good theory? 良い理論とは何かっていうのは3つ重要な要件があるとされています。で、これ当たり前かもしれません。It goes without saying that a good theory must be able to explain what's important. Okay. It goes without saying, but what's really meant by this is that it doesn't have to explain everything, because it's almost impossible for a theory to explain the international society or the world, which is such a impossibly complex and a huge subject that it's really impossible for a theory to explain everything. But it's important for a good theory to explain what's important. The second point, which makes a good theory, is that it's simple and clear. まあ、簡潔で明確っていうのは、まあいいっていうのはわかると思うんですけどね。だけど、これ1番目の問題とリンクしてます。まあ、複雑でもいいから、できるだけたくさんのことを説明できた方がいいっていう考え方もあるかもしれないんですけど、なかなかそれはね、この後見ていきますけど、難しいんです。だからやっぱりね、簡潔で分かりやすいってことが大事です。And the third one、これがちょっとね、皆さん説明必要ですけど、反証可能性がある。Can somebody guess what we mean by that a theory is falsifiable? これ、山本君、想像つきますか？まあ、言葉通りなんですけどね、反証可能性がある。どういう意味だと思います？山本君いますか？
はい。
まあ、文字面の意味だけちょっと言ってみてもらってもいいですよ。どういう意味だ？反証することが可能であるという意味なんですよね。でもそんなことなぜ大事かと思うでしょ？こう思いません？だけど、だってその反証できない方がいいじゃないかと。証明された方がね、良い理論なんじゃないかと思いません？だけど反証されることが大事だっていうのはどういう意味だろう？
議論が起きるってこと。
はい？
議論が起きやすいってことですかね。
議論が起きやすい？それはどんな理論もちゃんと議論はしなきゃいけませんよね。起きやすいか起きにくいかっていうのは、まあ理論によって違うと思いますけど、それはその対象が何かにもよると思うんですけど、今もうちょっと原理的なことでね、理論っていうのは反証可能性がないとまずいんですよね。反証可能性があることが必要なんですよ。なぜかわかります？これ具体例、ちょっと抽象的だから、ね、具体例で言いますかね。次の具体例で言いますね。はい、反証可能性がある理論と、そうでない理論とあるんですよね。で、この3つの事柄、which of the following three statements do you think are falsifiable? 1番のすべてのカラスは黒いっていうのは、これ反証可能性ありますかね？杉岡さん来ました？ 今来てますね。皆さんも気づいたと思いますけど、逆の順番にお尋ねしてます。杉岡さん、わかります？すべてのカラスは黒いって反証できますか？可能性はありますか？
あるかもしれないで
ある
す。
かもしれない。かもしれないでいいんですよ。そしたら可能性はあるんです。だって、ひょっとしたら白いカラスがいるかもしれないですよね。絶対にないと言い切れないでしょ。ね、突然変異のカラスいるかもしれない。これ、理論的に繁殖可能性があるんですよ。ね。だからいい理論なんです。変なこと言うようですけど。もう2番目いきましょうか。ハーレー彗星ってのは76年おきに、地球の近くにやってくるとみんな知ってますよね。これは繁殖可能性ありますか？誰に、下南さん、ありますでしょうかね。
ないと思います。
ない。カラスの場合よりはかなりないんじゃないかなというね、実際上の可能性ですけどね、相当確実に来るはずですよね。でもね、これ、あくまで原理的な話してますのでね、これやっぱり絶対にないと言い切れないでしょ。ひょっとしたら、いや、どっか遠く行ってる間に他の彗星とぶつかっちゃったらどうしますか？もう軌道が狂っちゃってもこれ反証されちゃいますよね。だから理論的にはこれやっぱ反証可能性あるんですよ。もうそういうふうに考えてください。Okay, so this is also falsifiable because you never know what happens to the comet. You know, we're almost sure that it will come back after every 76 years. You never know what happens to the comet. It may collide with another comet. You can never say for sure. So what about the third statement that God exists? Is this a falsifiable theory? 小林さん、どうですか
？3番のことですか？
はい。存在するっていうのは、反証可能性はありますか？
あると思います。
ある。
神は存在するってことが反証の可能性がある。
はい。反証できますかね？
これ証明しようがないんじゃないですか？
それまた違う話なんですよ。証明できないっていうことと、反証できないっていうことは一応違うんですね。証明はできないですよね。
はい。
じゃあ逆に反証はできますかね？
反証もできない。
そう、反証もできないですよね。
はい。
いや、我々大体みんなほら、キリスト教徒の人知りませんけど、I don't know if Jocelyn and Bruno, are you Christians? Do you happen to believe in God? But we're not talking about religious belief here. We're talking about scientific fact, you see. So please excuse us for that if you happen to believe in God. But as a scientific fact, this statement is neither, you cannot prove it, nor can you falsify it, nor can you disprove it. So that's the fundamental character of this statement. It's not falsifiable. So which means it's not a good theory. It's a bad theory. You see what I mean? Okay, so there can be countless other examples. 理論ということの本質ですね、ちょっとご説明しました。でね、これ、なんか当たり前のことをなんでそんなに大事なのかと思うと思いますけども、これ実はね、お気づきの通り、この3つともね、やや自然科学的な話ですよね、科学的な話ですよね。1番と2番そうだし、3番目はちょっと哲学的な、宗教学的な話になりうるんだけれども、一応科学的な話。どっちかというと自然科学の話です。だけど、この授業は自然科学の授業じゃないですから、this course is not a natural science course, it's about social science. So it becomes a bit tricky when it comes to social science, this statement, which is that all theory has to be falsifiable in order to be a good theory, is not necessarily true for social science. And I'll explain why. Think about the next question. Why do wars happen? なぜ戦争が起きる？これ社会科学の問題ですね。まあ一般論ですけどね。特定の戦争のことはあまり考えないでください。今のウクライナの戦争とか第二次世界大戦。特定の戦争じゃなくて、一般論としてね、一般的にどうして人間、ね、国家って戦争を起こすんだろうかというのは、北村さんどう思います？何が原因なんですかね？なぜなんですかね？何でもいいですよ。
民族や宗教の違いがあるからじゃないんですか？
民族や宗教の違い。So, yeah, ethnic and religious differences, yeah, that can be very often causes of war. Yeah, I think you're true. I think that's right. But there are other theories. That's one theory. 民族的対立が戦争を起こす一つの原因になる。もっと他にいろんなセオリーがあるんですよね。例えばですけどね、国家っていうのは必ず指導者がいますよね。それで民主主義の場合の指導者もいるし、そうじゃない独裁的な専制的な指導者もいます。で、特に専制的な指導者は多くの場合、権力欲が強いからと、権力欲が強いから戦争を起こすんだというセオリーもあるんですよね、昔から。で、まあ国内ではもう権力握ってるわけですけどね、さらに外国との関係でも権力を広げたいという、その権力者のね、人間的な傾向が戦争を引き起こすんだと。So this old theory says that it's the love of power of the dictator of a country, which is the main important cause of wars. And that's one theory. But come to think of that theory, is that theory falsifiable? 独裁者の権力欲が戦争の根本原因だっていうのは反証可能性ありますかね？片岡さんどう思います？反証できます？もう直感的にどっちだと思う？反証できる？できない？
できる。
できる？
できる。
じゃあどうやってあるいはね、逆に、まあ、証明できるかでもいいですよ。証明できますか？どうやって証明しますかね？だから、いいんですよ。片岡さん、誰か戦争をやってる独裁者に会いに行ってね、質問するんですよ。あなたは権力欲が強いから戦争をやってるんですかって。社会科学はね、ちゃんと調べて実証するとね、社会調査、田中先生なんかに必ずちゃんとインタビューしてその人に聞けというわけですよ。社会学の基本手法。ね、そしたら、そんなインタビューそもそもできればですけどね、まあ、正直に答えませんよね。どやされるだけで。例えば、プーチンに会いに行って、歴史遡っていろんな独裁者いましたけどね、ヒトラーとかナポレオンとかね、もう死んじゃった人に会いに行って確かめられませんしね。だからこれってね、基本的に証明できっこないですよね。ね、だとしても、これまあそうだろうと言われてるんであって、証明できないんですよ。だから反証もできない。だからこれって悪い理論ですよね。So it's a bad theory to argue that wars are caused mainly or very often by the love of power by dictators. I mean, it makes sense, but it cannot be proven because you can't really go and ask them directly, you know. So you see what I'm trying to get at. When it comes to social science, we cannot stick to this criteria for good, theories, not too much because it's impracticable. I mean, we have to make do with theories which have limitations in social science. Okay, now 一般論これぐらいにしましょう。で、ちょっとね、少し先急ぎますね。 国際関係理論のいろんな系譜をね、ちょっとざーっと皆さん見てもらいます。これ、あんまり時間かけません。でもね、こんな系譜があるっていうことをね、I just want you to look at what have been the major schools of international relations theory throughout history, okay? And I'm just going to explain the gist of all this. There have been two major schools of IR theory, which are realism and liberalism, okay? And both of these schools of theory have long histories. Realism can really be, we can go back to its beginnings as far back as ancient Greece. Well, how do you pronounce the name of this philosopher? Thucydides. He was a Greek philosopher who, I think I'm not an expert in this field, but he went into political science, and he is seen as one of the originators of realism. Machiavelli was an Italian. I think he was. He was a diplomat and historian in the time of the Renaissance in Italy. He's very well known. And Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes was, of course, an English philosopher in the 17th century. So all of these, well-known philosophers, more or less, in the old days, considered beginnings of realism. And then came classical realism. Despite the word classical, this is very recent. It's only in the 20th century. And E.H. Carr is seen as one big name himself in classical realism, as well as Hans Morgenthau. He's in this field. I suppose you haven't heard of him, but in this field, he's a big name. Okay, and in parallel to that, liberalism also had its very old beginnings in also philosophers, John Locke, Adam Smith, as well as Immanuel Kant. Those are European philosophers of the 17th, 18th centuries. And then came along for neorealism, for classical realism. You remember we looked at the history of politics in Europe. In the 19th century, there was the big peace conference in Vienna after the Napoleonic Wars, and then what they call the Concert of Europe was established. And this was very much a relationship based on the realist tradition of thought, which was that, several of the major powers were stacked against each other. They formed a balance of power. And that was very much a realist sort of concept in order to achieve a balance and peace. But at the same time, even in the 19th century, under the Concert of Europe, there was a certain element of liberalism which started to take place, because that was the first time for the first time, the major powers of the time got together and held conferences. They started to do summit meetings among the 4 or 5 European countries. That was very much a liberalist tradition which took root during that period. After the First World War, there was a big development in theory on both sides. And as you may recall, Wilson here is the US president at the time. Woodrow Wilson is often quoted as the flag bearer of idealism, which is one school of liberalism. And you can get the sense that he tried to promote cooperation among countries rather than countries facing up with each other in a endless battle against each other. That's more a realistic view of the world. But liberalism looks more at how countries can cooperate and form international organizations and even follow norms like self-determination and democracy, human rights, all that sort of thing. And then both schools developed into newer thinking. Realism became neorealism on their side. I won't explain all of this, but on the side of liberalism, famously, they came up with the theory of interdependence. And the big name associated with this theory is Robert Cohen and Joseph Nye. Also, another very significant line of thinking came along the concept of international cooperation around institutions or international organizations, if you like, and they call that school neoliberal institutionalism. And again, the big proponent of this theory was Robert Cohen. Okay. And I just wanted to show you this picture from it's more than 20 years ago. I happen to have the very honorable good luck to meet Robert Cohen himself in person. And this is when I was in my younger days. It's almost like 25 years ago. And I still recall this meeting with a lot of, it's a good memory. He was very kind. I was very excited and nervous to meet him. And I had expected to meet a man in his 70s or 80s because it had already been about 20 years since he wrote his seminal works, but he was only in his 50s at the time. And this was at Duke University. And he was very kind enough to come and meet me at the airport, driving his car himself. And so we had a good discussion of theory for a couple of days. Okay, so just a word about this other theory here, which is democratic peace. And guess what that means? It means that, the theory goes, democracies do not go to war with each other. No longer, they don't go to war. And there's a reasoning behind that. 民主主義的な国、民主主義の国同士は戦争はしないんだと。どうしてかっていうのはいろいろ説明があるんですけどね。で、これちょっと今説明早く後でお見せするビデオでちょっとそれを説明してくれる人いますのでね。これ一つのセオリーなんですよ。直感的に分かると思いますけどね。これ経験的には、I mean, empirically, this was true for a long time. The one seeming exception was the war between Britain and Argentina. And does someone remember? In fact, it was in 1982 that the United Kingdom and Argentina went to war with each other for a couple of months only, over their conflict over an archipelago, a group of islands called the Falkland Islands, and the UK was of course a democracy. Argentina was considered a democracy, but it was a bit tricky because they were under a military dictatorship at the time. So I think the theory was not falsified even by that war. The Ukraine war in Ukraine may be seen as an exception, but of course Russia under Putin cannot be considered a real democracy. They're more or less a dictatorship. And the same goes for Russia's invasion of Georgia, I think in 2008. Okay, there's another interesting theory, if you can call it that. It's not on the slide, which is called MAC peace. And I don't know if somebody can guess what they mean by Mac piece. 伊藤君なんか想像つきます？ It's called, this was, これ言い出したのはジャーナリストなんですけどね、ニューヨークタイムズの有名なコラムニストの人で、トーマス・フリードマンっていう人で、マクドナルドの店がある国同士では戦争は起こらないという。そういう、the theory goes that, no two countries which both have McDonald's shops opened will go to war. And that's also empirically, it's been empirically true for some time. But although I think it was probably refuted by the war in Ukraine, because both Russia and Ukraine have McDonald's shops. But the fact that they closed all the shops down in Russia after the war, maybe partial support of that theory still. Okay, right. So in any case, there were these two major schools of theory up till the end of the Second World War and even after that. And after the Second World War, there have been many developments on both sides. And I've already underlined in red this other school of thought, constructivism, is a very important new school of theories. 日本語ではこれ構築主義っていうんですけどね、まあ変に響くからカタカナでコンストラクティビズムって呼んでます。内容の説明は今日はしません。来週します。There's also some interest in this other theory, which is world systems theory. 世界システム論っていうのも結構有名な理論です。世界を全体を一つのシステムとして見る非常に面白い理論なんですけどね。イマニュエル・ウォーラステインという人の理論です。Okay, but we'd like to look at the first two schools of thought in a little more detail. Okay, いいですか? So this is a table to, to look into some elements which stack one school against the other. And let's look at what the main question is that the two theories ask. 主な問いかけは何だろうかと。これは2つの理論の、大体基本的性格を皆さんに理解してもらうためなんですけども、The main question that realism asks is why do wars occur? Why does it happen? And I just asked you a few minutes ago, what are the main causes of war? And we looked at this theory about the tendency of dictators, that they love power. That is one view of why wars occur. It's rather the classical realism school, which looks at the psychology of leaders in a way. But in any case, the main question is, it looks into the causes of war, whereas liberalism's main question is not that. Its main question is how can we prevent wars? これが一番主要な関心事項です。どうして起きるかっていうよりも、もう起きるのはしょうがないと、どうやって防ぐかっていうのが大事だっていうことですね。Okay, so the next comparison is who are the main actors, okay? You don't have to write this. I just want you to follow the logic of things. According to the realist school, the main actor is, of course, the state. And it's the state only which matters. It doesn't look very much into the other actors. It's aware that there are other actors, international organizations, corporations and all that. But it argues that, to make things simple, you really only need to look at the states. Okay. On the other hand, liberalism places a lot of importance on the other actors too. Of course, it places the state as at the center of everything, but it also looks at the other actors, firms, IGOs, NGOs, and others. The next line is what motivates states. 国家がまあ一応メインアクターだとしてですけど、国家を動機づけるもの、国家は何によって行動するのかですね。で、リアリズムは権力欲の、これさっきから言ってることですね。権力欲。まあ、指導者個人的な権力力だけじゃなくて、まあ、国家全体としてそうなってしまうというところがどうしてもありますね。そういう見方をするんです。それからリベラリズムはそれかなり対照的で、国家は、いや、そら戦争なんかどこもできたらやりたくはないんだとね。できたらやっぱり平和で戦争しないで共存していきたいと。したがってやっぱり主な関心動機は平和をどうやって実現するかなんだと。かなり考え方違いますでしょ。ね。あえて対比させてるんですけど。それから次ですね。だけどそこからの延長ですけど、国ってそもそも協力し合えるのかと、ね、いう本質的な問題。で、リアリズムは、いや、なかなか難しいんだと。基本的には敵対関係だから。ね、お互いに相手信頼してない不信感がだから協調あるいは協力は基本的にできないんだと、ね、いう考え方です。リベラリズムはそうじゃないんですよ。いや、できると。ね、現にあちこちで協力してるじゃないかと。まあ、競争関係ではあるけれども、協力もできるんだと。ね、非常に分かれます。それから何が一番重要な問題なのかと、これ皆さんそろそろ想像つくんじゃないかな。石丸くん、いいですか。リアリズムの人にとって国家の一番重要な問題は何だと思いますか。
その自分の国とかを発展させたり、利益を追求すること。
自分の国の利益を追求するということですか。まあ、それで、どっちにしても同じだと思いますね。リベラリズムでもそれはそうだと思うんですよ。だけど、リアリズムの場合は、どういう問題について利益を追求しますかね。どういう種類の問題が一番大事だと思いますか。
その国の権威とか権力に関わる問題。
国の権威、権力に関わる問題って具体的には何ですかね。
そうですね。例えば、まあ、防衛能力だったりとか、その軍事的な能力だったりとか。
そうですね。防衛能力、軍事能力はそうなんだけど、その防衛、軍事力を持つのは何のためですかね。何の問題があるからですかね。
その戦争とかがあるから。
戦争、安全保障ですよね、要するに。なぜ戦争をするかって言ったら、自分の安全を保障するため、あるいは戦争を防ぐためには安全保障が大事。リアリズムはそうなんですよ。その戦争とかを想定した安全保障、国の安全ですね。その問題が一番重要だと考えます。でもね、国際関係ってそれは大事なのは、それはそうだけども、それだけじゃないでしょという話。ね、リベラリズムはそれだけじゃないでしょ。経済その他のことも同じぐらいかそれ以上に大事なんですよとリベラリズムは考えます。安全保障ももちろん否定しませんけど。それから内政、その延長なんですけど、内政っていうのはその国の中のことですよね。中の政治ね。それって国際関係上どれぐらい大事か、内政がどうなってるかってことは国際関係。Does domestic politics matter in international relations? That's the question here. If it matters, to what extent does it matter? And the realist says, well, it doesn't really matter. No, most often it doesn't matter. That's their thinking. Whereas the liberalist says it matters. It matters a lot. It matters very often. So you see, there's a big difference here. And the last one is what is stability based on? What are the principles on which stability in international relations is based on, according to these schools of thought? And the realist school of thought says it's based on either hegemony or the balance of power. I mean, this is not the first time I'm mentioning this. You're familiar with this, I think. 覇権とかバランスオブパワー、例えばですけどね、がある場合は安定しますねっていうのがリアリスト的な考え方なんです。古典的なリアリズムですね、これ。Whereas in liberalism, it's not just that. I mean, they're not against hegemony or balance of power, but they place equal importance on all of these norms: democracy, free economy, and interdependence. Okay, so I think you get a rough sense, at least, of what are the differences between the two theories. Okay, right. By the way, there have been, as I said, there have been developments on both sides after the war, and the major developments on the side of realism, you see the change here, is they have switched from looking at the love of power into looking at the structure of power. And neorealism's first big feature is that they look at the structure of power, and that leads to looking at either hegemony or the balance of power as well in the world. And the other side, liberalism, also changed from just looking at these norms as elements for stable relationships into looking more at international cooperation through institutions. So that's another big feature of neoliberalism. Okay. So what I was going to do is, just hold on. I'm going to ask you to watch. We still have about 20 minutes, thankfully. So I'm going to ask you to look at two videos, okay, from YouTube. These are both in English. Okay, here it is. This first video is an interview with John Mearsheimer, who is a very well-known proponent of neorealism. And he's being interviewed by, I think it's a student. This goes on for about 10 minutes, but I'll just show you up to the first 7 minutes or so. He speaks very succinct English. I think you'll be able to follow it easily. Okay, just hold on. Here we go. I'm just going to make sure the sound is okay. 待ってください。Okay, here we go.
So what is the neorealist theory?
Neorealism is a theory that basically says that states behave according to the structure of the international system. It's how states are organized, what the architecture of the international system looks like, that largely influences how those states behave. And the key organizing principle of the international system is anarchy. And anarchy basically says that there is no higher authority above states. States are like balls on a pool table, right? They have no higher authority that sits above them. And the neo-realist or structural realist argument is that in the absence of a higher authority that can protect states if they get into trouble, what those states will do is they will compete with each other for power, because power really matters for your survival. If you're a state in the international system, you want to be able to survive. Survival has to be your highest goal, because of course if you don't survive, you can't pursue any of your other goals. But survival can be a very tricky goal in a system where there's no higher authority that can protect you if trouble comes. So to deal with that problem, you try and make yourself as powerful as possible. You want to look like Godzilla, because if you're Godzilla in the international system, you're really powerful. It's highly unlikely that any other state will attack you. So this is the sort of basic insight of neorealism, that the structure or the architecture of the international system, again, I'm focusing mainly on anarchy here, leaves states with little choice but to compete among themselves for power, because the more power you have, the more likely you are to survive.
Why do we need neorealist theory, and which phenomena do we want to explain with it?
Well, we need theories to understand how the world works. There's just no question that the world is an amazingly complicated place. And this includes international politics, of course. So for any individual, whether he or she is a policymaker or whether you're a student of international politics, what you're trying to do is make sense of the world. You're trying to figure out what are the principal forces that are driving state behavior. How can I get state A to do this? How can I get state B to do that? And to do that, you need theories. Theories are simplifications of reality. Given this complicated world out there, what you want are theories which simplify that reality and allow you to make sense of it. And what's nice about neorealism is that it is a very simple theory that people can use to help figure out how they think the world operates, how it works. And that allows people not only to understand the world, but allows them to think about what are the right or what are the wrong policies that states should pursue for their own benefit.
In which field of political science is neorealism mostly used, and can create a great advantage in using it?
Neorealism is mainly used, of course, in the subfield of international relations. And within the subfield of international relations, it tends to be employed more by people who study international security than international political economy. I do believe, nevertheless, that realism has a lot to say about political economy. But the fact is that it's people who study questions of war and peace, people who study questions about international security, that mainly focus on realism. That's the domain in where realism has its greatest impact. It's in the international security realm.
So what are the main limitations and the main critiques towards neorealism?
Well, the main limitation of neorealism is that, like any theory, it can't explain everything. My view is that theories, even the best theories, and I would consider neorealism to be among the best theories, can only explain about 75% of what happens in the world. That means that neorealism is wrong probably about 25% of the time. Now you're probably saying to yourself, why is this the case? It's actually quite simple. What we're talking about is dealing with a really complicated world, a world that's very hard to make sense of. And what we do, as I said before, is we invent theories which are simplifications of reality that help us understand that complicated world. Well, if you're going to simplify reality and come up with a simple theory, and simple theories are the best theories, that means you're going to leave some factors on the cutting room floor. In other words, some factors that matter in international politics are not going to be incorporated into your theory because you think they are not very important. Neorealism, or structural realism, pays little attention to domestic politics. It says you don't need domestic politics to understand how the world works. It's, again, the structure of the system that's largely determinative. But sometimes domestic politics really matters. And that factor that you left on the cutting room floor jumps up and influences a particular set of events. And in that case, neorealism is going to fail to tell you, a lot about what is going on in the world, because neorealism cannot account for domestic politics. Domestic politics is left out of neorealism. It's on the cutting room floor. But that's not to say domestic politics never matters. What the neorealists are saying is it only matters sometimes, and that's not very often. So I can afford to leave it out. But this is not to deny that there will be those occasions where domestic politics matters. So neorealism, like all theories, is a simplification of reality. And when you talk about simplifying a complicated reality, there are going to be instances where neorealism fails the test. And of course, this would be true of all theories.
Okay. I hope there wasn't too much echo. You were able to follow the discussion here. So the next video is somebody who promotes neoliberalism. And this is a lady professor from, I think it was one of the US universities. She's going to speak a little more quickly, so I hope you can keep up with it. It's again for about 7 minutes, okay? All right.
正確さと適切さ、この2つは似ているようで大きな違いがあります。
Here we go.
So moving on to other forms of international relations theory, let's look at liberalism and neoliberalism. Liberalism is actually one of the earliest forms of international relations theories. It was created shortly after the First World War, what was then called the Great War, to prevent another one. Scholars, thinkers, and decision makers got together and decided to question, what can we do to prevent another great war? So they started to focus on issues like common interest. How can we emphasize common interest among great powers, among global actors? How can we perhaps promote democracy as a way to prevent war? This leads us to a more contemporary notion that we call the democratic peace. Today, theorists suggest that democracies don't fight one another. This is the closest we come to a law in international relations. There are very few, if any, cases of democracies actually going to war with one another. So why? Why does democracy matter? There are two factors that matter when we talk about the democratic peace. Democratic institutions like checks and balances, elections, separations of power. Those types of factors help us prevent or mitigate against decisions to go to war. Democracies can't just willy-nilly decide one day, I'm going to go to war. They have to go through a process. Elections, elected leaders, allow the electorate, who of course pays the costs of war and suffers the consequences of war, allows the electorate to determine whether their leaders are fit to make those decisions. Separations of power, the fact that both the president and the Congress have to play a role in decision-making when it comes to war, would suggest that they check and balance each other, right? So the separation of power, the check and balance that comes with that, and the ability to elect democratic leaders really all work against, or at least mitigate in some way, against decisions to go to war. That doesn't mean that democracies are less war-prone. It just means they have to go through a process. It isn't as easy as non-democracies or a non-democratic leader to choose to go to war. The other factor that matters in the democratic peace are what we call democratic norms, particularly the norm of the peaceful resolution of conflict. Within democratic societies, particularly stable democratic societies, we resolve our conflict peacefully. What do? If we have a problem with our neighbor, if we have a problem with somebody that we believe has harmed us in some way, we sue them, right? We use our court system. Well, in the global community, that type of process doesn't necessarily exist, or it certainly isn't stable enough to prevent war. So this democratic institution of the peaceful resolution of conflict is something that works against decisions to go to war. So these two factors working together, democratic institutions like elections, checks and balances, and separation of powers, and democratic norms of the peaceful resolution of conflict, those really matter and are part of this liberal international relations theory. Now, democratic peace theory is not without its critics. As I mentioned before, democracies are not necessarily less war-prone. They're just less war-prone with each other. So there's this dyadic effect of democratic peace. It usually means two democracies or more than one democracy working together. Democracies and non-democracies actually still do go to war together far too often. So that's one criticism of the democratic peace theory. Others suggest that the process of democratization is extremely bloody. So democratic peace theory would lead us to a policy of democratization. We would seek to establish democracy around the world, suggesting that it'll be a more peaceful world the more democracies we have. Yet that process of democratization, transitioning from non-democracy to democracy, as we've seen in far too many cases, is a very difficult and bloody process. So democratic peace theory, it's useful and it's used often to help us understand the global community, but it's still fraught with challenges. So newer forms of liberalism, what we might call neoliberalism, emerged in direct response as a critique of realist theory. Neoliberals believe that realists are actually too narrow in their focus. They focus strictly on great powers and issues of power relations. This, to a neoliberal, misses a lot of international relations. If we're going to understand the global community, we need to understand more than just military security relations. We need to understand social relations, economic relations, scientific and technology exchange. There's a lot more going on in the global community, according to a neoliberal scholar. More specifically, neoliberals suggest that states often do cooperate, a lot more than a realist might suggest. Where realists tend to focus on conflict in the global community, neoliberals tend to focus on cooperation and the ways in which states come together to mutually resolve common problems. To do that, they'll develop international organizations, international laws, international treaties. These mechanisms allow states to mutually address their common interests and their individual self-interest through collective action. Now, the rules and regulations that emerge at the international level through this process actually create expectations for behavior. They lay out standards of how states should operate. Think about treaties regarding protecting the seas and pollution in the sea, or pollution in the air, or any other kind of environmental agreement. Any other type of collective international agreement that addresses a problem that transcends borders. This is a way that states create expectations and constrain each other's behavior. Now, of course, a realist responds, what do you do if somebody breaks the rules? How do you enforce these rules? Therein lies the problem. Nonetheless, neoliberals are concerned that we need to capture all of the global community when we look at international relations, and not just small aspects of it. Not just power relations, not just military security, but larger issues like economics, prosperity, science, technology, social relations, environmental concerns. They're much more varied in their agenda. States are much more varied in their agenda, and neoliberals capture that. So as we've done before, now that we've explored liberal and neoliberal theory, put on those sets of lenses and look at the global community and see how you view issues like democracy promotion in Afghanistan. How would you understand that if you are a liberal or a neoliberal and wearing those sets of lenses? How might you view global economic crisis, or specifically economic crisis in Europe, if you're a liberal or a neoliberal looking at it with those sets of lenses? And then finally, how about piracy and maritime security? How would you view the regulations and the various laws and treaties that have been emerging in that issue area if you're a liberal or a neoliberal? What do you think?
Okay. Right. What do you think? Okay, so don't worry if you're not able to follow everything she just said. You'll have another chance or two to see the video again. And I'm gonna ask you, just hold on, I'll bring everybody into the room. Okay. Right. So I'm gonna just show you what I want you to do for next week. And it is this, just hold on. Yeah. これが来週までの宿題です。来週もまた講義しますけどね。あとの2つの理論のことを来週講義しますけど、I'm going to talk about the other two main theories next week, but I'd like you to do this short homework till the 20th of July, which is basically just to look at the two videos that I just showed you. You've already seen it, so if you're comfortable enough, you can just write a few reflections. If you were not comfortable, you can probably look at them again. And just, I opened the box or a window, if you like, in web class. I hope you're all able to access that. It's a box called Report, Realism versus Liberalism. And so the rest is self-explanatory. Okay. 学部生の皆さん、別に英語で書くなとは言ってませんけど、野口さん英語でよかったら英語でもいいですけど、まあ、日本語でどうぞ、どちらでも。はい。いいでしょうか。はい。ちょうど時間が来ました。ちょっと最初、時間ロスしましたけど。はい。ご質問特になければいいですか？はい。これウェブクラスに載せますけど、スクリーンショットよかったら撮っておいてください。はい。じゃあ、はい、今日はお疲れ様でした。終わります。